This is Gardening in America, and I'm Ed Hume. Today we're in Boise, Idaho. We're in the Julia Davis Memorial Rose Garden, and I'm with Dale Fouts. Dale, when was the Rose Garden created?
It was established in the 1930s.
And how long have you been here?
I've been here for 7 years.
And this is a beautiful rose garden. You've done a magnificent job here. I noticed several different things throughout the rose garden. A lot of the roses are ground level, but you have some of them in raised beds.
That's because we had early spring, wet spring, and they overgrew us. So they'll be cut down before winter.
I see. What about winter? Is that a real problem with the roses here? Because you have severe winters.
Well, we got all these leaves on the trees behind me. We take them up, mulch them, put them about 8 inches deep around all the beds.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
And you do that on all the beds or each individual rose?
All the beds.
All the beds?
Yep.
And you're using only leaves?
Leaf mulch, right.
Okay. The reason why I wanted to emphasize that is for the home gardeners. You know, how can they protect their roses in severe winter climates like you have here in Boise? When do you prune the roses in spring?
In the spring, about April or May, depends on the weather.
It does.
Yeah.
And how high do you prune them?
Take a third off the top.
Third off of the top. Do you do any fall pruning of the roses?
Not really. Just as you go along during the week, we deadhead. We cut some of those long canes down.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay. So you'll leave the majority of the cane then intact. Dale, how large is the rose garden?
I've got 2,400 bushes in here, 237 varieties.
When's the best time to visit the garden?
June, middle of June is the peak of the crop when everything's in full bloom.
But it looks to me like this is a garden that's pretty all summer as well.
It is. It stays blooming all summer long.
I noticed back behind us that there is, and actually on both ends of the garden, a fountain, but it's very blue.
We put the blue dye in it to attract people in here so they come into the rose garden and admire the roses.
I can see that. That would actually be the reason why. Where is the garden located in relationship to other places in Boise?
Well, behind me you got the art gallery, and then to the back side over there is the zoo. So it's right between the zoo and the art gallery here in Julia Davis Park.
Oh yeah, it's a beautiful rose garden. And as you can see, you could get all kinds of ideas on the various varieties of roses that you could use in your garden. And you could visit the gardens to see whether they have trouble with mildew or black spot or whatever. So the rose garden really is a great educational tool for anyone in any place where you live. Thanks very much for sharing the garden with us, Dale, and for all your information on roses as well. And next time you're in Boise, be sure to visit the beautiful Julia Davis Memorial Rose Garden. Now let's talk about containers for the fall and winter deck. And in this particular case, you may remember I planted this up last spring with the rhododendron and the viburnum davidii and the different foliage colors. And to bring it up onto the deck at this time of the year really adds a lot of color, even though there's not much in bloom. Now, on the other hand, this is a container that I also planted earlier, and you'll notice the Sasanqua camellia that blooms during the winter and the fern down here, but I also added the variegated Pinocchio hebe here, and then also some winter flowering pansies, and then over on the sides here some flowering kale and flowering cabbage. So we've taken a container that was planted for one season and now have planted it for another season. And that's basically what I'm going to do with this container here. You can see that it had the summer flowering pansy geranium, Martha Washington, a little bit of Dusty Miller, and there's even a primrose here in the front coming into bloom. So now let's change seasons and add a little bit of fall and winter color to it. And I'm going to take, first of all, this flowering kale, actually it's a flowering cabbage in this case, and loosen the roots a little bit. This is wet, believe it or not, but it's just so dense with root system. And we'll dig a little hole here, kind of between the Dusty Miller and the primrose, being sure not to cover the primrose at all. And then in the center here, I'm going to add a few pansies, and notice that I'm using light color. In fact, colors. Notice I also picked a cabbage that was light in color. The reason being is that during the winter, the light colors really show up the most and the best in any planting. So we'll just add a winter flowering pansy there, and I'm going to also add one of the small blue flowering winter pansies. Actually, it's more of a viola than a pansy. We'll just add that right in there. And then for a little deeper color, because we do have the red back here in the background and the Dusty Miller foliage, I'll add a little bit lighter color here, or darker color, excuse me. And you can see already we're changing this from a planter that was beautiful in summertime to one now that'll be nice in the fall and during the winter season as well. And I'm going to plant the flowering kale then next. Boy, again, they are just so compact. You want to be sure to loosen them so they can go into that surrounding soil. Dig a hole here and put that in. And see, we've converted that container in a very short period of time to a nice colorful container that's going to give us fall and winter color. Even the primrose will continue to flower for a longer period of time. So take out a few minutes and brighten up those containers in your yard too. It's raining outside, and this is a perfect day to start thinking about winterizing the fuchsias. A few things that you want to know. When you bring the fuchsias in, cut them back, and cut them back if they're hanging baskets right to the edge of the basket, like so. And the reason why we do this is, as you can see, last year's growth had no leaves on it at all this year. So we cut it back so that we can get a nice, bushy, beautiful plant. And then it's a lot easier to store it. And of course, we're in the greenhouse, and this would be an ideal place to store a basket of fuchsias, or any of the fuchsias, whether they're the upright or the trailing type. We still would cut them back though. And by the way, we can take cuttings if we want to from the tip growth of these fuchsias. Now across the top, you'll notice that I'm cutting them somewhere in the neighborhood of about 8 to 10 inches from the actual soil level. And that's the best way to do it, because there, once again, you don't have as much of the bare stem showing when the new growth starts next year. So that basket's all ready for winterizing. And the place that we could put that basket, if we wanted to, would be in the basement or in the garage, anywhere where the temperature's above freezing over winter. And I'm just going to show you again on this, because this is a broadleaf and more of a hanging type, how we do prune it back as well. Now, this could also be put in the crawl space under the house. Or another thing that we can do with this is to take it outside, dig a trench in the soil, and bury the pot. Bury it about, a foot to 2 feet deep, and put a little bit of a drainage material below, and then set the basket on its side. And then the next thing you want to do is to cover with some type of mulching material. It could be bark, it can be sawdust. Also then, here, let's take one of the cuttings, one of the tip growths here. I'll remove all but the top, and I'll just cut right below this node here. That's a point where growth originated earlier. And I'll dip that into a little bit of rooting hormone here, like so. Knock off any excess rooting hormone, and then we can set this right in a potting soil, or you could use sand, or you could use vermiculite or perlite, anything of that nature. And don't expect just the one cutting to take, so I'd take several of them, and it's such an easy, quick job to do. And you probably could count on somewhere in the neighborhood of, maybe 1 out of every 3 taking, so be sure that you take enough so that you have plenty to fulfill your needs for next year. But now's a good time to get those fuchsias into their winter resting place. Look at this beautiful planting of salal and even Oregon grape, and there's rhododendrons and azalea down in here and a few other plants. And what comes up in the middle of them but blackberries? How do you get rid of these blackberries? You notice the wind is blowing today. This is not a good day to apply any type of a weed killer or a brush killer. And that's exactly what I have in my hand, is a brush and blackberry killer. If I was to spray this onto this plant today, the wind would carry on to other plants. Plus the other thing is it would drop to the foliage below of the salal and the other plants and kill them too. So that's not a good idea, is it? Is what I'll do instead is to take the top off, and I'll just take a little bit of a cotton swab, and you'll notice I have gloves on here, and I'll just pour a little bit of that weed killer onto that cotton swab, and then I'll swab the leaves. Although I'm using cotton in this particular case, I prefer to use a brush or a sponge to do this job, but cover the leaf thoroughly. That's the direct route back to the root system, and right now is a perfect time to control blackberries and other nuisance weeds because they're building strength into the root system for next year. Now, having said that, here's, I think, even an easier way to control this problem, and that is to take a Maddox and go down and grub them out, because blackberries are really kind of surface rooted and generally quite easy to root out. So I know you can't see this, but I'll work here on the root system and see if we can't get this out. And generally, of course, with all of the, did a good job of getting this one out. You'll see in a minute. Get all caught up in them too. But see, I get the majority of the root system on that. Well, not all of it, but I can go in and work at that a little bit more and get that out. And see, that's all of this is coming from just one vine. Of course, it's rooted probably back here. Yeah, it has. Rooted again back here in the back. And I was able to get all of that out. But that's a great way to go after these blackberries and kind of clean up the area and not worry about weed killers at all. Now, having said that also, let me take you to another area and show you another way to control blackberries. How would you like to have all of these blackberries? Boy, what a mess, huh? Now, the important thing is, again, the wind is still blowing. So, we've got to be sure, first of all, that if we spray, that's apt to carry the mist onto some of those desirable plants. We don't want that. Second thing is, I would wear a face mask spraying this large an area. And probably the most important thing of all, read all of the directions and apply the herbicide only as directed. And if you do that, you can help get rid of those blackberries this fall. Fall is an excellent time for planting or transplanting trees or shrubs in the garden. And now that I've said that, I have to tell you that I transplanted this wisteria vine this past spring, which is also a good time for transplanting. This vine was almost dead, and look how beautifully it's grown over the summer season. So if you have a plant that's not doing well, or maybe it's the wrong location, then transplant it. And now's a good time to do that. I'm getting ready to plant this area, and this is, of course, a beautiful lavender, and I've used it for its foliage color. This is a dwarf variety of rhododendron that's nicely budded and is going to be beautiful in front of this wisteria and flower earlier. But look what's happened here. Look at these weeds. Let's get them out by all means. Get rid of them. We don't want them growing in that soil. We don't want to transplant weeds into the garden, do we? So this is going to be a nice plant in front of the wisteria. And here's another plant that I want to plant, and I've already prepared the planting hole. This is a Nandina domestica, in fact. We'll just set it over here. Now, if you're not certain of the drainage in your soil, this has good drainage, and I'm not worried about it. Take a bucket of water and just pour it down into that drainage hole and see how long it takes for that water to drain away. I know because of the soil throughout this area that this will drain probably in about 15 minutes. I need the moisture down there anyhow, though, because I'm putting in some dry peat moss. I like whenever I plant to add moist peat moss to the soil. And also I'm adding some processed manure, the stuff that you buy in the bag at the nursery or the garden center. And it needs some moisture too. Now, with that also, I will mix that with the existing soil below. And in this case, because of the amount of water that I poured in, that's going to be kind of like soup. But that's all right, because I know this will drain away. If you come back, if you do it in your garden and come back 3 or 4 hours later and it still hasn't drained away, then you know you have a drainage problem. And you probably should dig a sump hole or a French drain or something to tile away the excess water. Now, here's the plant that we're going to plant, Nandina. Oh, by the way, I'm going to put in about a handful of fish fertilizer because I know it won't burn the plant roots. And that's important whenever we plant into the soil, that we use a fertilizer that will not burn the roots. Okay, I'll take this out of the pot. Whoops, the label fell in here. Take it out. Set it upright. Pull the surrounding soil in and be sure the top of the root ball is level with the soil surface. That's all you have to do. It's easy, and now's a perfect time for planting or transplanting trees and shrubs into the garden. There are really some interesting plants that provide color during the fall season, and our plants of the week this week are two of them. This is Enkianthus. This happens to be a variety called red bells, and that means that the flowers are red in the spring. But the regular Enkianthus, Enkianthus campanulatus, has yellow flowers. Actually, they're yellow with a little bit of orange in them, and then there's red veins, and they're very, very pretty, and they hang down, they're bell-shaped. But it's what's really outstanding. In a few weeks, this will be brilliant scarlet in color. The autumn foliage color is really nice. And on top of that, these branches during the winter, even though they're barren of foliage, provide a really nice silhouette. So if you can use them maybe around the entry area or somewhere where there's an outdoor light, you'll really enjoy this plant. Beautiful in springtime when it's in bloom, gorgeous with its autumn foliage color. And then the plant behind is a plant called Euonymus Alata, or we call it the winged euonymus because of its unusual branching pattern. They're kind of flat in their branching pattern. Or we also call it burning bush because you'll see the red color coming into the leaves now. This will be brilliant scarlet. Actually, it takes on a scarlet to a rose tone. Very, very nice plant. Now, the important thing about both of these plants is that they grow best in full sun. This one does not want to take much pruning at all. Actually, I wouldn't give it any pruning. On the other hand, this you may want to shape a little bit, the euonymus. And this one, by the way, will grow probably somewhere in the neighborhood of about 7 to 10 feet, although there is a dwarf variety called compacta that will grow about half that tall. Beautiful plants to add to the landscape, and now is a good time to select and plant them. Our two plants of the week, the Enkianthus and the winged euonymus. We're in Boise, Idaho, and I'm with Dee Roberts, who has a magnificent small garden. Dee, where do you come up with these ideas?
Well, I visit other people's gardens whenever I can. I went to school in the San Francisco Bay Area and was always fascinated by the old little tiny gardens in the beautiful old Victorian neighborhood. So I tried to get that look.
Well, that's an ideal place to get an idea for small gardens because they are small. Where do you come up with the color combinations too?
Well, because it was so small, I really felt like I had to limit the palette. If there was no place a la Gertrude Jekyll to go from the hots to the cools, so I just stayed with the pinks and the blues and the whites and lavender and purple, but no yellow, orange, or red, real true red.
And it's so beautiful where you've combined just those three colors together. You know what is, I think, outstanding in the garden too is the way that you've used containers.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things to do. I can try things out in containers that if you tried to pull it off in a long perennial bed, it you'd be taking a big chance for the whole season, and a container is just portable, and if it doesn't work, you just hide it and put something else out.
Yeah, right. The other thing I've noticed through the garden is that you've got some art touches. Are you an artist?
My husband and I are both craftsmen. We have a fine arts background, and I guess that's where the design and, get used to looking at things and seeing things and wanting your environment to look the way you really enjoy it.
Who came up with the idea of painting the fence the way they did?
That was my idea. We didn't want to spend the money to replace the fence. It
Sure.
was really terrible, and because this is such a small space, I almost have to use all of the borders to either with planting or something to make it interesting.
Sure. I noticed also that you have some really interesting bird baths. Those are
Yeah.
very clever.
Yeah, my husband is the bird watcher and the bird feeder, and that's something that he just has to have in the garden.
Now, over winter with the geraniums, do you keep them or do you replace them each year?
I dig them up every year and shake the dirt off and store them, and early spur, late winter, get them out and pot them up again, and then take cuttings from my favorite ones if I need more of them.
All right. Thank you for sharing this garden with us. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have today. Hope you can join me at this same time next time for Gardening in America.